And now I would like to introduce my colleague and Planning Committee member and Indigenous scholar, Kyle Bobbywash, who will introduce our keynote speaker. Kyle?
Uh, Thank you, Kim. Ani, bonjour, welcome. I thought it important to say hello and welcome in my own language, as it's not every day that I have the honor to introduce a colleague hailing from the Three Fires Confederacy, a long-standing alliance between the Anishinaabe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a mother, scientist, decorated professor, and enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. She is the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants, which has earned Kimmerer wide acclaim. Her first book, Gathering Moss, A Natural and Cultural History of Mosses, was awarded the John Burroughs Medal for Outstanding Nature Writing, and her other work has appeared in Orion, Whole Terrain, and numerous scientific journals. In 2022, Braiding Sweetgrass was adapted for young adults by Monty Gray Smith. This new edition reinforces how wider ecological understanding stems from listening to the Earth's oldest teachers, the plants around us. Robin Tours Wide Lane has been featured on NPR's On Being with Krista Tippett, and in 2015 addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations on the topic of healing our relationship with nature. Kimmerer is a SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor of Environmental Biology and the founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, whose mission is to create programs which draw on the wisdom of both Indigenous and scientific knowledge for our shared goals of sustainability. In 2022, she was named a MacArthur Fellow. She holds a BS in Botany from SUNY ESF, an MS and PhD in Botany from the University of Wisconsin, and is the author of numerous scientific papers on plant ecology, bryophyte ecology, traditional knowledge, and restoration ecology. As a writer and scientist, her interest in restoration include not only restoration of ecological communities, but restoration of our relationships to land. She lives on an old farm in upstate New York, tending gardens both cultivated and wild. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer. Uh, Miigwech, Robin, Guyen. Thank you so much for all these wise words and stories. Just a reminder to participants to please ask their questions via the Q&A tab. That way I can see it and we'll get these questions. And maybe starting off, Robin, again, pleasure to meet you. And I think something that's, we're at a sustainability and Canadian agriculture conference. You're talking about the UN. We know governments are going crazy about creating indicators or measurables for sustainability. And you mentioned it very beautifully, talking about making sure that youth know more about plants. What are maybe potential indicators or metrics that you would use to, make sure that humankind is on the right path when it comes to something like sustainability? Oh, I think you're still on mute, Robin.
There, that sounds better. Yeah. I just want to say bonjour, nice to meet you. And what a good question. I'm so glad you brought up metrics, because if we don't have metrics for things, we tend not to measure them, right? And it's so often much is left off. And to me, the kinds of things that are most indicative of sustainability, beyond the things that we already know about, the biological indicators, the economic indicators, the equity indicators, is relationship to land. It feels to me that what we really have to do is heal our relationship to land. So what might the metrics for that be? I think it has a lot to do with our fluency in who our neighbors are, knowing the plants, knowing the birds, not because we have to know their scientific names or even their official names in any way, but what I mean is observing them, being in relation with them. We have to know their presence in order that we can sort of monitor their well-being, for example, right? So paying attention to the living world is manifest in names. I would say that metrics for a healthy relationship with land are things like the ability to feed yourself from the land, right? Clean food, either by foraging or in cultivation, right? Um, so, uh, yeah, those are a couple. I could go on, but I'm sure you have other questions.
Yeah, no, thank you. And maybe kind of even picking up on this, right? You're talking about feeding ourselves and clean food. And Laura asks, how can we maintain hope for more sustainable futures when everything seems to be moving rapidly in the opposite direction? Right, I can imagine things are getting worse. Maybe technology is really focused on economic development sometimes. And how do we maintain hope as a people globally?
Yeah. Well, I think that question was really aptly framed because what is it? What are the stories that we're told? Yes, there's so much gloom and doom, all the negativity, and there's good reason for that, right? Because corporations and for the most part political leaders are not doing the right things, right? But you and I and many of the people in this audience know different stories as well about people who are making both small incremental changes and transformational changes on the land, in their communities, in grassroots efforts. So that's what makes me hopeful. Um, the very fact um, that there are so many people yearning, longing for sort of a just and green way of being, it tells me that the culture is shifting. The culture is shifting ahead of political leadership, and that's a good thing. Um, so I think it's also important that to keep our hopes up is that we share our stories with each other, as I imagine you are doing at this conference, right? That we share our stories so that we feel each other's presence, are encouraged by each other's work, um, but at the same time, keep our sleeves rolled up and know that our small incremental actions matter greatly, but we also have to have system change as well, and to use our levers to change political will and therefore the political landscape. It's not easy.
You mentioned in the talk, we talked about the Maori River Wanganui with personhood. And, Sema asks, are there more examples of what has not been given specific to the agricultural sector? And I think they're thinking, what would you imagine the sector to look like if we had that worldview of all beings, both inanimate and animate, having personhood?
What a wonderful question. I would love to have a sit and have a cup of tea and imagine this together, but on the fly, to me, what that would look more like is like permaculture. Because permaculture being so deeply respectful of the land and the gifts and responsibilities of all the participating plants, it is so much less extractive. It kind of embodies the notion of long-term benefit rather than short-term economic gain. Um, and so, yeah, as I would begin to think about that, I would think it would look like a permaculture landscape. And in many cases, things like agroforestry is an important part of that permaculture landscape. I'm thinking about a colleague of mine who has been working with the ecology of prairie strips in between cultivated lands, sort of a combination of permaculture and annual crop agriculture, and the addition of these swaths of native prairie and native plants, pollinators, birds, everything has so improved soil quality, water quality, and yet maintained productivity on the land. So when I am imagining with the questioner what that sustainable landscape could look like, that's what's coming to mind for me is this sort of an agroforestry landscape with strips of native vegetation and crop agriculture in between. There's so many examples of it being done. We simply have to choose to do
There's a whole whack of people that are, interested in agricultural education, and these educators that are specifically telling or teaching youth about agricultural systems and maybe environmental impacts of food, well, what would you hope to see communicated to youth as, we try to think of a balanced approach and how to talk to them about not only some of that Western approach, but maybe some of these indigenous values associated with environmental impacts of food and agriculture?
Yeah. You know, I especially like how you framed this in what are some of the indigenous principles that
Mhm.
could be used here. And gosh, I'm going to fall back on the principles of the honorable harvest, because it feels to me like they apply to whether we're doing row crops or tree crops or animal agriculture. That the notion of the honorable harvest, that whole protocol that says we need to not consider the land and those beings our property, but sort of our partners in this work, that whatever harvest we undertake has to be honorable, in that we don't take too much, in that we always leave plenty of behind for the other beings who need that, that we use a technology that limits harm, that we share everything that we take, and that most importantly, we reciprocate the gift, that in return for that harvest, we give back to the system that gave us that harvest. And you and your colleagues in this conference know best what those reciprocal practices are. Cover crops, right? Green manures, I don't need to list those because this is what you do. But those, I think, can be understood in the context of reciprocity, of how do we give back to the soil in order that the soil can continue to sustain us. I don't need to tell you, it's all about the soil.
No, no, thank you. And you mentioned, maybe not necessarily having as much language as you would like. And I feel I'm on that similar path of learning Anishinaabe-Mowin. And
Yeah.
this particular questioner here, I know she's getting really good in Anishinaabe-Mowin. But she wants to know, how can we start reconciling the loss of language through agriculture, plant sustainability, and thinking and utilizing these elements to strengthen or maybe build up our language?
Oh, I love that question. Like you, I am a student of the language. I never progress as fast as I want. But one of the places that I've been concentrating is on plant names, um, because the plant names contain so much about right relationship to those plants, to the gifts that those plants have for us. And I talk about this often, but it seems like the right answer to your question, and that is you both know in studying Anishinaabe that the grammar of animacy, the animacy of our verb conjugations is challenging, no? But it is for me also the power of the language, because it in the language, um, we cannot objectify the living world. We have to speak of the living world as alive, as beings, as persons, not as things or commodities. And that, I think, is one of the most powerful elements of our language for sustainability, is that every time you speak of the world and cannot say about the world, it reminds you to act with that these are our relatives, and that we have to treat our plants and animals as if they were our relatives. And that powerful component of our language is something that I wish would translate to English.
I'm going to reword this particular question because I think it's really pertinent, both as, say, academics and maybe as people as well that are working with community. And we know things like genetic technology is moving so fast with molecular modifications of plants, and there's all these issues. And even with citizens and communities, they might not necessarily be as even up to date as, say, academics are. Do you have particular thoughts or ideas on how to maybe utilize some of this new molecular genetic technology to not only advance our science, but maybe to advance how Indigenous people create relationships with plants using some modern tools?
I find myself, perhaps like many listeners, conflicted around this. Um, as a scientist, as a biologist, I see the power and look at the data about things like precision farming, right? So that just the right genotype is planted for the right soil, for the aspect, so that we can fine tune the way that the crop plants are responding to the soil. That's that's powerful. And I think about, elements of disease resistance, for example. But I also embrace the notion that these tools that fundamentally change the identity and the genetic sovereignty of our plant and animal relatives um, are ethically challenging. There's for me, there's no way around that ethical challenge, while at the same time, I understand the power of that technology. And to recognize that our ancestors are consummate plant and animal breeders, right? That still maintained the genetic sovereignty of individuals by using traditional breeding rather than genetic modification. But there are also examples that I know of where genetic modification of plants for restoration. I think about things like the American Chestnut Project here at my own university, where the notion is that those chestnut trees for which they're changing a single gene that will make them resistant to the chestnut blight, which means our forests and our agroforestry landscapes could once again have this cultural keystone species present. But it's being done in a way that, for me, mediates some of those ethical concerns, not all of them. Um, but for example, these trees are never to be patented. They're to be used for only for forest restoration and not in monocultural plantations, but for real restoration. And with that in mind, um, I can make a more powerful argument for that kind of application of the technology. But I still want to say that while as a scientist, I can see the pluses and minuses, essentially, I have an ethical uh, constraints about modifying the genome of our sovereign plants. And you know, through our long history of interaction with land and other beings, we humans have a pretty bad track record when it comes to thinking that, oh, we've got this. This is under control. We know how to manipulate the natural world in such a way that all will benefit. And our record is just not good on that. So I would take the perspective of humility to say, we don't know enough about the details of the function of the balance of the ecological world to go messing around
And I don't know if you're paying attention to the chat, but you're getting wonderful feedback and people are really appreciating all your words. And this particular question is really interesting to me because I'm trying to improve myself. You know, this person loves your storytelling, your cadence, and they're asking, do you have advice to share what has been helpful in cutting through the jargon to speak in ways that are truly meaningful to people when you're trying to talk about science, talk about all these relationships?
it. Yeah, yeah. I so appreciate that question. And I actually turned the chat off because it's distracting. I really want to listen to you. So I'm not seeing that. Um, but one of the things that as a science storyteller, really, one of the things that I rely on is our Anishinaabe medicine wheel teachings. And remembering that in the medicine wheel, it reminds us that we humans have four ways of knowing, at least four, I'd say, of mind, body, emotion, and spirit. And most of our scientific communications are only on one half of that medicine wheel, the mind, the intellectual knowledge, and the physical evidence, those things we can measure and observe, all powerful ways of knowing on which Western science is based. But for storytelling, for persuasion, for trying to help shift people's thinking, facts alone doesn't get us there. In fact, just a few years ago, the acronym is the AAAS. It's the American Association for the Advancement of Science. They put out a recommendation that I thought was stunning for scientists that said, facts are not changing people's minds. Yeah, we know. We have all the facts we need about climate change. And um, so to me, that means that we need storytelling. And to do good storytelling, I think we need emotional intelligence and a spiritual perspective as well to combine with the empirical, intellectual. And that allows us to meet our listeners where they are. It allows us to engage talking about values, not just about information. And information alone is not going to do it. We need to move from information through knowledge to wisdom. I found this on the web.
I just got back from AAAS, and I'll say not everyone has got that message. People are still trying to build knowledge instead of what you say, talking about building wisdom, right? That implementation science and how to use this knowledge in a really good way.
Quite so.
Someone in the chat's asking, these ideas, and you mentioned it yourself about ecosystem services. That's a very human-centric Western perspective of that relationship. How can we create a worldview that allows us to value those behaviors, those things that are happening on the ground that don't necessarily connect to something monetary to allow, if we are trying to get or convince government to, oh, this is important because it has value monetarily, but there's other values there. What can we go about and how do we get there?
Right. That ecosystems services concept is so, well, both promising and problematic at the same time. It's so much better than not counting those gifts from the land, shall we say, codified as ecosystem services. But the very idea, again, we're back to that, what do you list? What do you measure as values? And one of the big flaws, I think, in the ecosystem services framework is that it seems to rely on thinking about ecosystem services as a one-way flow between the natural world and people. That there are these services, often translated, that can become valued as commodities, right? How much value do we ascribe to clean air and soil fertility, et cetera? But I think the missing piece is this worldview that it's one-way flow from nature to people. Where is the reverse arrow in ecosystem services that is the invitation, indeed the imperative, for human people to give back to nature? And that would be, I think, a really sort of healing element to the ecosystem services framework, to make it reciprocal and instead of one way. Because when we do that, I think it will expand our imagination of these economically, monetarily valued services more into relationships and values as well.
And maybe kind of picking up on this idea, this comment of worldview, and I'm combining a lot of questions here because we're running out of time.
Oh.
And there's often this perspective of environment versus the economy, right? And it's going to take a major shift in the world to do things a little bit more holistically. What are tools or ways that we need to start thinking about our relationship with the land and with each other to allow us to maybe get there a little bit faster?
Well, I think one of the first things that we have to do is, you've sort of answered your question in in its framing, right, is that we have to break down that dichotomy to say that we can have either economic flourishing or ecological flourishing. Um, that's the kind of thinking that has us where we are in this point of crisis, of thinking of, well, there's nature over there, people over here. In fact, what we need is this mutual flourishing, to know that when the land is healthy, people are healthy and the economy is healthy. Destroying land is not a sound long-term ecological strategy, right? We know this. And so just uncoupling that feels really important. I think about, for example, this amazing work out of the UN a couple of years ago that showed that 80, is it 80 or 83% of the world's remaining biodiversity is in indigenous homelands, like, oh, yes. And why is that? Because we don't have that worldview of, well, we're going to keep this piece of nature nice and wreck this one over here. It's that mutual flourishing, that people and nature can live well together. And just, I think of some of the beautiful, hopeful examples of things like Menominee forestry and any number of examples where there's economic flourishing, but also ecological well-being. Mind you, economic flourishing is not the same as economic hoarding and the vast sort of greedy accumulation of economics. That's not sustainable in any worldview.
And looking at the time, we have a whole bunch of, I know, my students, policy analysts, academics, just normal people from normal society here. Are there particular last words that you want to share with people to encourage them to progress on their journey, or anything like that?
Oh my gosh. You know, I guess one of the things that I would want to say, which is probably unnecessary to your audience, is to really trust in the guidance of the plants. I think a lot about the answer to so many questions is plant. I mean, plants know what to do about excess carbon in the atmosphere, right? They can't do it all themselves. We've gone too far for that. But planting as climate mediation, for example, planting for soil renewal. But I also love the double meaning that English gives to that word plant. You know, as a member of this agricultural community, we know planting, nature-based solutions is the way. But I think we also have to plant our feet. We have to really plant ourselves on our principles and on our values, and refuse to be complicit with those forces of destruction.
Robin, Miigwech, thank you so much for this wonderful session. I think we're go on health break right now, and the next session will start at 2:30. Again, following up on many of your wise words when we'll be talking about the role of Indigenous perspectives in reshaping our food system. But thank you for launching us off and starting us off in a very fantastic and a good way here. Miigwech.
Miigwech, I can't wait to see what you all come up with. Bamapi.
Bye.